All right, we can go ahead and get started, I think. Well, hello, everyone. My name is Alexis Miller. I work with the Office of Visitor Services and Volunteer Management, and I'd like to welcome everybody to our July Smithsonian-wide Volunteer Enrichment Program about our Olympic collection. We're so glad that you can join us today. Even though the Tokyo Games have been postponed, they'll start 1 year from today, we still want to celebrate with you and to give you the opportunity to hear from today's speaker, Kenneth Cohen, the Edward and Helen Hintz Secretarial Scholar and Curator at the National Museum of American History. Before I pass the program off to Dr. Cohen, I do want to mention a few logistical items. I want to let you know that this webinar is being recorded. We do plan to send it out to all volunteers soon. Also, please note, this is a Zoom webinar and not a meeting, which means that you, as an attendee, can only see and hear the speakers. We cannot see or hear you. You should see two icons at the bottom of your screen. Depending on the device that you're using, they may be at the top. We will be using the chat function and the hand raising function for this program. If you run into any technical issues during the lecture, please use the chat function, what looks like the typical message bubble, to ask those. Chad, a member of our team, will be monitoring the chat for those questions. If you have content-based questions you'd like to ask Kenneth when Kenneth is sharing, we welcome those too. He has left time for you to ask content questions after each section of his talk, and he'll let you know when he's ready for those. When he is ready, if you want to ask a question, please click the raise your hand button, which looks like a hand on your screen. When able, another team member, Abby, will unmute you and ask you to ask your question. Once you have asked your question, Abby will mute you again. This is to make sure that there's as minimal feedback as possible from everyone's microphone. We'll get through as many questions as we can in the time that we have. Lastly, we will have a couple of polling questions to ask you today. When we launch those, please follow the prompts on your screen to participate. So with that, I'd like to introduce Kenneth Cohen. Please take it away.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for making the time to come and join us and talk about our Olympic collections, which of course span multiple units at the Smithsonian. I'm based at the American History Museum, but I work very closely with the curators in charge of sporting collections at other museums around the mall. And so I've pulled from all of our collections in order to inform today's discussion. So when Alexis originally reached out and asked about this topic, I said, we should really talk about why we collect the Olympics. What does it say that the Smithsonian thinks that that the Olympics are an important thing to collect from? And what should we as Smithsonian museums and interpreters say about it to our visitors? So that's really sort of the big questions that I'm asking. And I'll be looking for your feedback on some of these things as we get through the discussion, including right at the start here. So let me ask you, what do you think of when you think about our Olympic collections? And I think there's a poll for our awesome staff to share here. So go ahead and make your choice, and then we'll get to see what everybody says. It's a great opportunity for some feedback. When there's so many of us on this webinar together, I miss having the sort of face-to-face and getting some direct information from you all. And so now we're seeing the results come in real time. I made a prediction that the talk actually proceeds from a working assumption I have, and we'll see if your data actually matches my assumptions. Just 20 of you left to shift the balance, particularly between equipment and tickets and memorabilia, it looks like. Give this another second. A couple people making some very difficult choices. I understand. All right. Why don't we go, why don't we end the poll and see the results here? We'll share them. There we go. So it goes in order. It looks like medals with a clear 25% lead over uniforms, which then has a minimal lead over tickets and memorabilia, equipment and advertising. So I came pretty close. I had medals first, uniforms second. I had equipment third. The way that they're listed vertically in order on the poll is the way that I had assumed it would go. So let's see how this turns out. Oops, sorry. We can get out of there. So why do we think about medals, do you think? And here it's a little harder to sort of have a Q&A about each of these. But there's been a lot written about the materials that are produced during Olympic Games periods. And most of the scholarship says that, you know, people are interested in seeing medals, touching medals if they can't at the Smithsonian, but being close to them because medals represent winning, they represent success, they often represent the best known people. And so this medal actually is from somebody who might not be well known now, but was certainly well known at the time. This is a gold medal from Bobby Joe Morrow, who was a US track and field athlete in the 50s. He won 3 gold medals in the 1956 games in Melbourne, Australia. So medals sort of represent winning and success. And so we connect those to the Olympic experience because everybody wants to end up winning in their event. Uniforms, the scholarship says, gets us close to the body and the actual performance. These are what historians and curators call witnessing objects. These are things that were present at a really important moment in time. And so since that moment has passed and we can't actually go back in time, these are objects that get us very close to the people who made those important events happen and make us feel like we're back there. This is a jersey from the 1980 US Olympic hockey team that won the gold medal against Finland, but defeated the Soviet Union in the semifinals more famously. And it was won by Bill Baker from that team. Now, equipment gets us to something a little bit different. And here, it's usually... Hi,
Kenneth. I'm sorry. I'm going to break in real quick. We don't see your screen for the images.
Oh, thanks for breaking in. It must have broken when we went to the poll. Is this better?
Yep, I think we got it now. Thank you.
No, my apologies. So here's that medal from Bobby Joe Morrow from 1956 that we were talking about. Here's the Bill Baker jersey from the 1980 US hockey team, one of those witnessing objects. And here we should say, you know, the hockey team, of course, won the gold medal, but witnessing objects don't have to be about success. And we'll see some examples of those as we go through the talk. This example is a field hockey ball from the LA games in 1984. It's from a manufacturer that had been making the field hockey competition balls for several Olympiads up to that point, and they're listed on the ball there. Now, the equipment's actually a little bit of a different story. Equipment usually appeals to fans or players of that particular sport. And the Smithsonian's sports equipment collections are actually the oldest of our Olympic and sports collections in general. They date all the way back to George Good, who was the original curator of the National Museum, now the Arts and Industries Building, AIB, who saw the growth of leisure and leisure technology as symbolic of the industrial and social progress of the United States. And so he made an effort to collect a lot of newfangled leisure goods in the 1880s and 1890s direct from the manufacturers. So unlike the jersey or the ball or the medals, which are connected to individual people, the earliest Olympic and sporting collections in the Smithsonian come direct from the manufacturers themselves, because the Smithsonian was more interested in sort of documenting technological progress than it was in tracking individual histories. And again, that's a shift that we'll come back to over the course of the talk in just a little bit. The point was to sort of track progress in the same way that the Smithsonian tracked progress with all of its collections in the late 19th century. And here you see what's called, if you look at the very top of the exhibition case here, it's called a synoptic series, a synoptic history. So the goal here is to collect every iteration of a thing as it's made or invented over time. And so these are loom shuttles over the course of time. And there's several other of these cases that were put together in the 1880s and 1890s. But we have done that historically with our sporting collections. Our figure skates, which go all the way back to the ones that Good first collected from Peck and Snyder, which was a very early manufacturer of ice skates in the 1880s in New York, through a range of Olympic skaters, from Sonia Henne on the top to Kristi Yamaguchi on the upper right, and then more recently Adam Rippon on the lower right. And besides the individual stories that these objects tell, they also do continue to track that technology. So you'll notice in Rippon's skates that instead of having directly vertical bridges that run down to the blade from the sole of the shoe, Rippon's skates have an arc. And this is an invention within the last 10 years that allows skaters, when they press down on their skate, to create flex in the skate itself, which enhances the bounce they get off the ice when they jump. So the number of quadruple axels that we've seen and heightened rotation jumps in figure skating are a direct result of the technology of the shoes that allow the skaters to do those fancier tricks now. We also track that technology in swimsuits. These are two drastic examples, I think. And we do it in basketball shoes, a range of sporting equipment, both Olympic and non-Olympic. We also have a synoptic series of the football helmet and its efforts to protect and failures to protect the head. So we come back then to our question, what do you think of when you think about our Olympic collections? We've covered the medals, the uniforms, and the equipment. Memorabilia and the fan experience are also something that we collect. And this, of course, is the experience that isn't the players, but of attending or consuming the games. And this is most people's interaction with the Olympics. We have a range of tickets, souvenir guides, maps, calendars and schedules, all of those sorts of things. And also then advertising, which recognizes that the games are a big business. And we'll get back to that point at the end of the talk. But the International Olympic Committee made a little bit more than $4 billion from the 2018 Winter Olympic Games, which is enough for them to have just recently floated Tokyo an $880 million loan to cover some of its losses, as it will continue to incur expenses over the course of the next year in the run-up to the games that they hope will take place a year from today. Most of that money today comes from TV rights, but GM and other manufacturers do often become corporate sponsors to the Olympic Committee and pay for that, for the right to say that they have that status. So this is the range of materials in the Smithsonian's Olympic collections, but it's always important to look beyond the types of artifacts that we have and pay attention to what people and what themes are represented, and also what's not represented, because these scopes of a collection shape what we can say about it and shape what visitors think about the subject. And so here's where sort of the title of my talk comes into play. We're keepers of the flame. That doesn't just mean that we're keeping these objects and protecting them. It also means that we're keeping alive and even researching and discovering stories that our visitors may not already know, may not already be familiar with. Some numbers then show why we should consider the collection's limits. There have been 49 Olympic Games since the modern version began in 1896, and you'll see that in the graph in the middle, with the blue bars being the last 50 years and the red bars being the first 72 years. Just over 80% of the Smithsonian's Olympic artifacts, this is including both summer and winter games, 80% of the Smithsonian's Olympic artifacts date from 1968 or later. So in other words, the first 72 years and 23 games reflect just 20% of the collection. This isn't surprising. It's actually true across our sports and entertainment collections around them all. It wasn't until the 1970s that these topics were deemed valuable for scholarship and exhibition beyond the limits of industrialization and physical recreation that Good laid out in the late 19th century. That's to say that the value of sports and entertainment as mirrors of our cultural values, reflections of our cultural values, but also as arenas where we debate and push to change those values. Sports and entertainment's roles in this regard were not recognized by scholars in general or Smithsonian curators specifically until the 1970s, as these photos from early donation, these photos from early donation ceremonies of these kinds of materials demonstrate. The cultural and political functions of sport, which we're seeing now in athletes' engagement of both the coronavirus pandemic and activism in opposition to police brutality, these cultural and political functions have always existed, as we'll see more in a moment, but the collecting of sports and entertainment artifacts from individuals as part of their individual stories related to their social, cultural, and political impact, rather than just the impact of the sporting goods industry, didn't start until 50 years ago. This chronology of the collection has important implications. One is that the Smithsonian's steady efforts to expand the collection to reflect the diversity of America's Olympians makes it look like that diversity and political activism started in 1968, when in fact it has much longer and much more complex history. For instance, some of the showcase items in the sports collection at the National Museum of African American History and Culture are Olympic. Carl Lewis's top, which you see here from the 1984 Los Angeles Games. Jackie poster of Lewis after he won his 4th medal at those games, and then his actual gold medal from the long jump at those games. Here's Jackie Joyner Kersey's shoes from her Olympic trials in 1984. And of course, Tommie Smith's warm-up worn on the podium in Mexico City in 1968. As my colleague Damian Thomas, who leads the sports curators at the African American Museum, will tell you, none of these items were collected solely to celebrate these athletes' victories. Across the institution, curators of sport and entertainment constantly tell visitors and donors that we are not a hall of fame. We collect not to celebrate success, but to document what it means to compete and to entertain. Interpreting Carl Lewis's track career through his own quote about wanting to inspire people from all walks of life, not being sports specific, encapsulates our approach. For those of you having trouble with the text here, here's Carl Lewis saying, "I want to be remembered as a person who felt there was no limitation to what the human body and mind can do, and be the inspiration to lead people to do things they never hoped to do." Similarly, Ibtihaj Mohammed's donation of her fencing mask from the 2016 Rio Games to the American History Museum says something similar. Wearing this mask over her hijab as she helped the women's saber team win a bronze medal is a physical representation of her hope for an America of tolerance and understanding. She's been quoted recently as saying, "I was going to have to use my platform as an agent of change. There's a lot of bigotry, but I know that it is a fight that we all need to find ourselves a part of." Yet materials documenting the diverse stories of earlier Olympians are largely missing from our collections. Several units have ticket stubs like the ones you see on the right, and photos like the one you see on the left from the 1936 Berlin Olympics, but we have nothing material from Jesse Owens. And again, this isn't surprising. Owens returned from having undermined Adolf Hitler's theories of Aryan supremacy to face segregation at home. He later recalled, quote, "It became increasingly apparent to me that everyone was going to slap me on the back, want to shake my hand, or have me up to their suite, but nobody was going to offer me a job." Owens barnstormed, sometimes racing horses, and sometimes giving lectures about the power of sports to prove equality. And this particular photo is really demonstrative, because the woman riding here, Bernice Dean on the right, the museum actually has that riding suit. The American History Museum, Bernice Dean was a fairly famous rodeo rider. Of course, her fame doesn't at all measure in a historical sense to Jesse Owens, but it's telling that the museum has Bernice Dean's costume and very little from Owen's. Owens's speeches on his lecture circuit, of course, were a bit ironic, since he rarely secured endorsement deals or advance payment. In fact, he ended up having to sell 3 of his 4 gold medals and countless other items in order to pay for his travel and accommodations on his tours. Those items went into private collections, and when they come up to market these days, they sell for hundreds of thousands of dollars or even millions of dollars, far beyond what the Smithsonian's museum acquisition budgets are. Units have athlete credentials, guidebooks, and tickets galore for past games held in North America, except for the first one. Yet the St. Louis Games of 1904 are important because they do not fit the model of using sport to break down racial barriers. St. Louis authorities organized separate, quote, anthropology days for segregated archery, javelin, and even completely invented competitions such as mudslinging, involving the people who were put on display from European colonies at the World's Fair that went on at the same time as the Olympic Games in St. Louis that year. With few international competitors coming to an event nestled in the American heartland that was pretty hard to get to in 1904, US competitors made up over 80% of all athletes in 1904, and so they represented their hometown clubs rather than competing for a limited set of national team spots. African American leaders urged Black athletes to boycott segregated St. Louis, but George Porridge from Wisconsin competed and was the first African American to win a medal. 2 bronzes, actually, in the 200 meters and the 440 hurdles. A second Black medalist, Joseph Stadler, perhaps the intended recipient of this photo, concealed his racial background and passed as white. Some photos of Porridge's career before the Games are the only known surviving artifacts from his career at all. Perhaps the greatest athlete of all time was Jim Thorpe, who won the pentathlon and decathlon at the 1912 Summer Games. Thorpe also was more than a Hall of Famer with experiences that communicate the overlap between racial and class oppression in American history. The Smithsonian's only artifact from his lifetime is this amateur trophy, won at a 5K late in his career. It's an ironic thing to have because Thorpe was stripped of his 2 Olympic medals for violating the Olympics amateur code at the time. He had played semi-pro baseball in North Carolina a couple years before for something between $2 and $12 per game. This was an era when the Olympic notion of amateurism essentially functioned to keep poorer people from competing with the wealthier or better connected folks who could train full-time and have their expenses covered without needing to be paid for their sporting performances. The National Museum of the American Indian possesses some speeches and buttons from Jim Thorpe's daughter, Grace, while she was petitioning to have his medals posthumously restored, which they were in 1983, 30 years after he died. But the original medals were given to the athletes who had finished second in 1912. They, in turn, had given those medals to museums in Scandinavia, and those medals, in turn, were subsequently stolen from those museums sometime during World War II. So Thorpe's children could only receive copies from the 1912 mold, which were actually on display at NMAI as part of an exhibit about Native American Olympians in 2012. But as for Thorpe's daughter, Grace's speeches, which you can see on the right here, an example of, they're actually one of our SI transcription projects right now. So you can check that out and do some of the transcribing to contribute to that project if you want. The early Paralympic Games are less a story about oppression, but still one about absence. The Paralympic Games started in an organized fashion in London in 1948, mostly for soldiers who were wounded in World War II. The American History Museum's curator, Jane Rogers, has done path-breaking work to build a Paralympic and adaptive sports collection, some of which you can see here. Yet notice the dates again. The Paralympic Games became more formally tied to the Olympic movement in 1960, and since then their games have followed on the heels of the traditional games in the same city and using the same venues. The absence of earlier material is no fault of Jane's, of course. Incredibly, she and the American History Museum have acquired non-Olympic, but still very rare 1950s wheelchair basketball materials belonging to Ray Werner, who was a wounded World War II veteran, and who played in some of the first national competitive wheelchair basketball tournaments in the country. None of the Smithsonian's current or even recent curators are to blame for the general lack of early Olympic material. The further back in time you go, of course, the rarer things get. They're hard to find in family collections. They're very expensive when they come on the market now. And there's a higher chance that compelling objects are already in other public institution collections. The absence stems from earlier curators who largely ignored sport and certainly the Olympics as important historical events for generations. But the result of these realities is that our collection obscures the longer history of the games. Sometimes this missing early history simply reveals that America's Olympians, like America, has been diverse for much longer than the collection suggests. Sometimes that earlier history, though, is crucial to understanding later events and items in our collection. The stories of Jesse Owens and the St. Louis Games in 1904 provide context for what happened later. Carl Lewis knew Owens's legacy, as you can see from this photograph, and their connection to each other through his parents who were track coaches. Lewis's parents were track coaches. And John Carlos and Tommy Smith were not making a statement any more political than how Owens's victory was treated for decades as an example of equality and opportunity in the United States, despite ongoing racism, or any more political than what the St. Louis organizers did by segregating African-American athletes in terms of residences and staging mock sports to justify the subjugation of people of color from around the world. In many cases, the missing early history is particularly unfortunate because it reminds us that the Olympics and sport in general, I'd say, are not naturally or inherently venues for asserting equality. Sports do not always, as Namak's gallery says, level the playing field. The Olympics in particular have also been a venue from time to time for constructing inequality, and there's no scientific law preventing them from being used that way again. The danger is that not telling these earlier histories can actually invite visitors to see our Olympic collections as evidence that political statements and diverse athletes are new and somehow related phenomena, which they're not, fueling misconceptions of a past era that is often represented and portrayed as being somehow less political. These misconceptions, ironically, also fuel the kind of thinking that leads to opposing the collecting of Olympic and sports items themselves, as the pioneering curators at American History discovered when they collected Muhammad Ali's robe and gloves in 1976. And I'll read from one of the many, many letters in the Smithsonian archives that were written by Americans from all over the country who either really supported or really opposed the acquisition of this kind of material to the Smithsonian collections. Here's a letter to Texas Senator John P. Tower, and it says in part, "I have talked with a number of my fellow Texans, and it is the consensus that these articles from Muhammad Ali have no place in the Smithsonian, and we request that they be removed." So there's a long history then here to both our collections and also to what's both in the collections and what's not in the collections. And what we're working with, we being the curators of the sports collections across the Smithsonian, is how to make sure that those longer histories still get told, even though most of what we have is newer stuff. And so I'd be interested to hear what you think about that history, those connections, what our visitors think, and what they learn from our exhibitions about sports. We can take about 10 minutes now, and then I'd love to sort of move on to some of the business and advertising stuff that didn't get quite as much attention in your poll.
Okay, so now would be the time for folks to raise your hand, and I'm tracking that. We do have a raised hand from a bit ago. So Lisa Winton, do you still have a question? I'm going to unmute you now.
It was answered.
Oh,
great.
excellent.
Thank you, Lisa. Okay, Jerry Richmond, I see you on here. I'm going to allow you to talk.
I guess this may be premature, but do the Smithsonian collections cover anything with respect to the U.S. boycott in 1980 and the issue, the issues that relate to that boycott? If that's something that's going to come later in the presentation, then I'll just pass by.
Yeah, no, it's not coming later. There's, it's hard to squeeze sort of all the bits and pieces from the various collections into a 30-minute thing. So thanks for asking that. We do have materials on the boycott. We have objects that were used at Olympic trials. Several events in 1980 went ahead with their Olympic trials and actually selected their contingents before the announcement that we were not going to participate. So we have several individual stories of folks that can be told through their artifacts of having tried to qualify for those games. And then less in our sports collection, but in our political history collection at the American History Museum, we have a number of bumper stickers that are advocating for the boycott as a sort of political statement. So we have two sets of objects, you'd say. One from the athletic apparel of athletes who didn't end up going, none of which, actually some of it might say USA on. I was going to say none of it was actually national team stuff, but some of it was. And then the explicit political advocacy behind the boycott, which related, of course, to the Soviet Union's invasion of Afghanistan.
Great. Victor, looks like they have a question. I'm going to unmute you, Victor.
Okay, hi. Yes, you were talking about acquisition and the fact that the lion's share seems to be after 1968. Do you have specially earmarked funds from the History Museum budget for acquisitions, or is it a food fight when it comes around on the yearly budget? And are you interested in acquiring? I have some Olympic memorabilia from Montreal and Mexico that I'd love to give if you want them. So how do I go about it?
Great. So let me take the first part of those. So we do have an acquisitions budget. Each unit does. There are also institution-wide funds that can be tapped, but those have to be sort of extraordinary objects and go through a series of approvals, as you might imagine. The unit by unit, museum by museum, separate acquisition budgets are relatively small. The Smithsonian relies, as we say, on the generosity of the American people and our donors who want to preserve their objects for our visitors in perpetuity. So, we are not able to compete. And in fact, most museums aren't able to compete. The explosion, this is a whole separate talk, but an article that a bunch of the curators who work in these fields are putting together right now about the explosion of the memorabilia auction market that has essentially priced museums out. Most of what's not already in a museum collection, it was very hard to get into a museum collection at this point. Just about the only way that the big ticket items get into museums these days is if a donor buys the object knowing ahead of time, essentially buys it for the museum. So the memorabilia market has just exponentially exploded over the last 30 years. And the prices that go along with that have really priced museums out. Regarding your personal items, I'd be happy to see photos. So we generally, when folks send us emails with stuff they want to donate, we ask for pictures, and then we take a look at pictures. We talk to our colleagues, and we'll definitely give you a response.
And who do I send it to?
You can send them to me. And if you Google my name and Smithsonian, you'll get my direct contact, my Smithsonian webpage, and there will be a little entry form at the bottom to contact me directly.
Great. Thank you. This is fascinating.
Yeah, thanks for joining.
Okay, Linda Feldman, I'm going to unmute you, Linda.
Hi, Linda.
Linda, any other questions?
Oh, okay. Sorry. For next year's Olympics, what might you want to collect that would be different from past years because of these singular weird circumstances that we're in now?
Oh, we should have waited, Linda. You should be next because that is what we're going to talk about in a second. So
Okay.
Can you hold that? And then I'll be really interested to hear your thoughts.
Okay, and let's do one more before moving on. Leslie Boss, I'm going to unmute you. Leslie, do you have a question for us?
Hello?
Hi, Leslie, we can hear you.
Yes, hello. I am interested in knowing how when collections of a certain type are located all across the Smithsonian, how a curator finds them. How do you know about all these things and how do you work together to utilize those in your research?
That's a great question, Leslie. Yeah, so I don't know how we should do another poll about how many of you are familiar with collections.si.edu, which is our general web interface for collection searching. But of course, not everything is in there. And archival materials in SOVA, S-O-V-A, which is our online archival catalog, also are not item by item complete. So we really rely on each other's knowledge working in our own buildings. You know, you could do some preliminary searching through these online interfaces. And we also have one that is in-house just to Smithsonian staff, our digital asset management system, the Smithsonian DAMS. And so we use those systems to sort of try to find things. But more often than not, what happens is you see some things and then you follow up with the curator of record at the museum where you saw something that was interesting and you say like, hey, you know, you have this, do you have other things that are like this? Can I come over? Can we take a look? So we spend a lot of time crisscrossing them all, looking at each other's collections, sharing insight, particularly in the field of entertainment and music and sports. I'd say that the curators across them all are really cohesive as a team in terms of how we're trying to use these collections and how we really are trying to work. You know, so many of these items, because they're recent, many of our visitors, and we have at the American History Museum, we have data to show this. Many people come to the museum, over 80%, I'll just use the number, over 80% of visitors to the American History Museum, at least in the before times, since we don't have any visitors at the moment, stated to our front desk that they were looking for, when they come to the front desk and they say they're looking for something, they say they're looking for something from our entertainment, music, or sports collections. So visitors have a really strong idea of what it is we have and what it is they want to see, and often they already have a connection to those objects and to those individuals. So really trying to find something that gets people to be surprised, to discover something new about something they think they already know very, very well, and in many cases they do know very, very well. This is our challenge with this collection. It's a little bit different than, you know, curators of you know, some of our other collections, either in the American History Museum, if you talk about, say, farming technology and combines, things that lots of our visitors don't know about right off the bat. So we have some challenges, and it's really nice that we're working together to try to solve them. Alexis, we'll move forward now.
Sure, that sounds great.
And we'll have some more time moving forward now precisely so that we can have some more time in a few minutes to ask a few more questions with the broader compass of the rest of the talk in mind. So I want to conclude then by going back to our opening poll and then looking forward to future Olympics. And I hope by now you can see that one of our goals with the Olympic collection, the sports and entertainment collections more generally, is to help explore entertainment, the Olympics, as something more than periodic moments of national pride or enjoyment, and individual achievement, that they're rather a shared global moment that both reflects but also shapes how Americans think about their country and how they think about their various countrymen and countrywomen. So as we head towards next year's games in Tokyo, as I think Linda mentioned, and then down the road towards the Los Angeles games of 2028, because our opportunity to collect is always greater when the games are domestic, because we all obviously have closer connections to the organizing committee and the host city and all the sort of staff and participation and folks working in the infrastructure than we do when the games are abroad. So how do we collect from the games next year, hoping that they go forward in one format or another, which could be entirely precedent-setting, right? The games may take place in Tokyo, they may not, they may take place at scattered venues around the world. There's conversations about that. And then the Los Angeles Games of 2028, which are the first Olympic Games to have been proposed without proposing building a single new venue. Los Angeles's bid was that they've already got all the infrastructure in place, particularly since they are building the opening, so the idea is to avoid what happens in Athens here, and this is the softball stadium in 2014 from the 2004 games. And this is the image I was about to go to, the last of the stadia in Los Angeles prior to the game's opening, which is heading towards its completion for this fall, which is SoFi Stadium in Los Angeles. And not being built specifically for the games, but rather specifically for the NFL and then for a variety of other entertainment events as well. So how will we capture not just the consumption of the games from the fans' perspectives and the performance in the games from the athletes' perspective, but also the social impact of the games and the games as a business? Lots of economists, of course, have studied the Olympics over the last 30 years, and there's a broad consensus that actually the games almost always cost more than they're projected to and generate less revenue than they're predicted to. So Tokyo is likely to find this out on a colossal scale, in part because of the delay. Their proposed budget was $7.3 billion. They had already spent $13 billion by January 1st of this year, so they'd almost gone over by 100% by January of this year. With attendance very likely to be below expectations next year, given the virus. The projected losses for Tokyo at the moment, as of the latest reporting last week, was around $26 billion. London's games cost $18 billion and only made $5. So many of these losses come from the unsustainable facilities that we saw before from Athens. Rio's games, of course, famously involved the displacement of roughly 60,000 of the city's poorest residents in order to develop transit venues and housing for the games. So what are we going to collect from these games moving forward? Will it be technology from the new stadia that's supposed to be more environmentally friendly, creating more of an individual fan experience? Will budget documents? A lot of what I've just talked about are budget numbers, because budget documents are not exactly a visitor attraction. We don't put those up on exhibit to great fanfare very often. But what about materials from not just the volunteer and paid staff of the games, but construction workers, and other folks who are involved in developing the game's infrastructure? I'd be interested to hear your thoughts about what kinds of materials, besides obviously the potential next year for masks, which, as you may have read, there are hundreds of plans for both the American History Building and other units to collect masks of various kinds. But I think we need to think more robustly about how we're going to represent the Olympic Games in the moment next year, rather than just the personal protective equipment. And then there is the potential for an additional layer in terms of how we represent athletes. The International Olympic Committee reaps benefits from the Games by awarding the Games to cities who promise to build and spend lavishly, at least historically. That's not been true with LA, but in other cases. But the IOC actually contributes only a couple of $1 billion to the host city's budget, while making more than they spend because they keep the vast majority of global television rights and advertising. The International Olympic Committee is now under pressure directly from athletes to increase athlete performance pay, that there should be participation payment, not just medal payment in the Games. And this is a result of hundreds of athletes prior to the Rio Games having turned to crowdsourcing sources such as GoFundMe in order to fund their training up to their trials, even though their actual travel to and housing and board were covered during the games themselves. The U.S. Olympic Committee at the moment awards $10,000 to an athlete for a bronze medal, up to $25,000 for a gold medal. And of course, those sums only go to the winners. So there is wide complaint from athletes across many nations, cohorts, that they are not being treated or paid fairly, considering the amounts of money that the International Olympic Committee brings in every year, and that they spend that they do not spend like the host cities do, and do not go into debt in the same kinds of ways. So why not collect buttons, stickers, and digital content developed by the athletes to press their case for pay? The American History Museum has the country's most significant labor history collection, with materials from unions and organized labor causes going all the way back to the 1860s and 1870s in the United States. Further, if you consider the Lowell mill workers in the 1840s and 1850s to be unions. So including sports in that collection would again underscore that the games are much more than mythic or nostalgic moments, as we've seen now. They have political and social impact, and of course, they are also economic events for the organizers, the host cities, and ultimately the athletes too. If we can tell all these stories, then we can make up a bit for the absence of the early material by presenting, I think, the Olympics as a stage that highlights, yes, hard work, beautiful skill, and opportunity, and that also notes that hard work, beautiful skill, and opportunity also describe what goes into actually making the games what we've always dreamed them to be. Thank you. So I'd be happy to take thoughts and questions, and we might actually, I think, have a poll here to sort of ask you what you think about what we might collect from the upcoming games, both in Tokyo next year and then LA 28, which are our two big targets at the moment. Now this is much more competitive. We do not have a clear winner here. That's really interesting. And I did not have a prediction here. I didn't know what would happen. So this is really interesting. And I'm now taking notes for me and all my colleagues. I'm going to screen capture this so that I can share it. Thank you all. Great. I'd be happy to hear questions about this from everyone, of course, but especially if you were one of the 8 people who said other, I wonder what was in your head.
So we'll start with Victor. Victor, I'm going to unmute you.
Okay, there we go. Sorry. Yes, I put other because I think the whole question of the Olympic venue is a very important one and a controversial one. I remember hearing a few years ago people like Christine Lagarde, the head of the IMF, as well as a number of other prominent international people, diplomats and so forth, and studies that have been done by Oxford and Australia and others, irrefutably seem to point out the fact that not only are these events largely not beneficial to the host country, but actually can cause all sorts of social ills and typically, as you pointed out in the case of Brazil, something like 60% or something of the people living in favelas were displaced. So I think in keeping with the role of the History Museum, it would be interesting to have more context, the social, economic impact and the effects of the Olympics, and the question of whether the Olympics, as many have suggested, should be moved back to Greece permanently. I mean, Greece, no, seriously, depends a great deal on
debate,
tourism. You know, they're the basket case of Europe in terms of economy because of the, you know, they don't produce much. And I don't mean to be pejorative about it, but I'm being realistic. And so something like this would be a big boon to the Greek economy. So those are my points.
Yeah, that's really interesting. You know, the question with venues is always sort of what you can get, right? We have a lot of pieces of stadiums in the collection, right? We've got seats from Ebbets Field and a variety of other ballparks that have since been torn down. You know, but you know, what do you do for something that has either just been built or is decaying but not being knocked down? You know, how do you document or collect from that kind of situation is a curatorial challenge that we haven't solved yet. The other point is, as I mentioned when I was speaking, it's a little bit harder for us to get items that get to these issues very easily when the games are outside of the United States, right? You can imagine how the Rio organizing committee or Rio city officials or Brazilian officials wouldn't necessarily be jumping over the fence to give us evidence of what happened at the favelas in Rio prior to the games. So there are challenges in terms of acquisition. Now you can go directly to individuals. You can go to members of those displaced communities and get their stories or some memento that that sort of reflects on the home that they got kicked out of. And that's you know, that's something to think about. You know, it's not something that we did in Chavez Ravine with the LA Dodgers Stadium, which is probably the best known example of something like that happening in US sports history.
Okay, I'm gonna let Maureen ask her question. Maureen, I'm about to unmute you.
Okay, my question is whether or not you also collect sort of events that are either kind of part of the Olympics or surrounding Olympics, like the, you know, the opening ceremonies and the, you know, coming in on the whatever it was, and I think it was in Los Angeles where he dropped in from somewhere, and also things like the shooting of the Israeli team. Whether, you know, you have things that are just somewhat, they're really things that people remember, but they're somewhat tangential to the events themselves.
That's a great question. So that is one way. The opening ceremony question is one way to get at a broader story, right? Because the opening ceremony performance usually is some sort of national narrative. It's how that nation is presenting its history and its hopes for its future to the global community. And so that's a really good idea. We have athlete materials from the opening ceremonies. Many times when we collect sporting outfits from a particular event, the sporting event itself, we also ask for and often receive the opening and closing ceremonies outfits along with the actual athletic outfits and the warm-ups. So they usually all come together when they do all come. So we do have a number of materials from the athletes' perspective in terms of the opening ceremonies and the closing ceremonies. We have not done as good a job of collecting from the opening ceremonies performance, which is, I think, something you're alluding to, and I think that's a really good idea and something that we should look at, particularly for the LA games. When you mentioned the events in Munich with the Israeli wrestling team in '72, so we have several U.S. athlete credentials from those Olympics. Again, we tend to collect, not our job as the National Museum of American History or as the African American Museum or as the Museum of the American Indian, is not necessarily to collect the Olympics for the sake of the Olympics, but we collect, sort of key American moments that are reflected in or that take place at the Olympics. And so we have some US athlete materials from 72 that we can use to say, and this athlete was living in X dormitory, which was this far from where the shooting happened, or this athlete's event was delayed and postponed, or was one of the ones affected in terms of its calendar by the shooting. But we don't have anything from the Israeli team in 72. And it's hard for us to get materials like that, not only because it's harder for us to actually access those materials, it's also hard for us to collect. Remember, we, each of the Smithsonian museums has a collecting mandate, has a collection plan, and everything that comes into the museum has to fit to that plan. And so things that don't involve directly Americans can sometimes be harder to collect under that mandate.
Okay, we have about 3 minutes left, so we'll see if we can get through 1 or 2 more questions. Linda, you are back. You're up.
Okay, so what I'm thinking about for the Tokyo Olympics or leading up to it is the coronavirus story and how creative athletes are being in their training facilities, training equipment under really weird coronavirus circumstances. So I'm not exactly sure what that looks like, but you get the idea.
Yeah, I'm trying to think of what those materials might actually be. Some of the things I've seen in YouTube videos, are actually pretty mundane things, which I think could be cool. It's relatively easy to get that stuff. And it doesn't look like what they're using it as, right? So, I mean, a lot of them are using PT bands in various ways for resistance training, of course. And then a lot of them are using online resources. And the Smithsonian is developing, we don't have in place, but is developing what we call Born Digital Collecting Plan, which would allow us to basically, what the technical term is scraping, to scrape something off the internet and put it in our collections. And then we will preserve that digital asset the same way we preserve a hockey stick or a set of skates or something physical. And so, a lot of the workout videos or routines that athletes are doing, or even the broadcasts they're doing to show people how we even know any of this is happening, right? We could try to collect some of that material. Rights get a little tricky with that stuff, as it turns out, because I've tried on this front. And so YouTube is actually, even though people take from it all the time, that's actually illegal. YouTube is not a public interface in terms of intellectual property rights. So if you put up a video to YouTube, we can, and I take it for the museum and the museum shows it, I actually need to get your permission in order to show the item, even though what you've put up for everybody and anybody in the world can go see it. The law at the moment says if you create a YouTube video and you put it on YouTube, you're understanding that people can go to YouTube and see it. You're not understanding that other people can take it and show it wherever and however they please. And so there's a little bit of a rights negotiation to have to get, and you actually have to have the same kinds of conversations that you have if you're trying to get three-dimensional material artifacts. But these are things we need to start tackling, because you're right. I think this is a pretty unique story in terms of how these athletes have gone about their business.
So Kenneth, it looks like we're at 5 o'clock. So I don't want to take up more of your time with the questions. We have a couple more, but I think that was good.
Feel free to email me, people.
All right, great. Well, thank you very much, Kenneth. We really appreciate your time today, and we will be sending out this lecture shortly to our volunteers. So thank you again. Thank you all for your time, and thank you to Kenneth.
Thanks for coming, everyone.
Have a good day.